I used to be a park ranger, and even I don't believe the horror I found in the woods. I'm posting this as a warning. There are things out there that you don't want to know about. Stay away from them. Don't go looking for them. I'll tell you my story in hopes that it will quench your curiosity. It was a night like any other night, at least lately. I had barely arrived at the ranger station, and there were already 4 calls of vacationers' homes getting broken into. Out here in the West Virginia Wildlife Preserve, people tend to think that just because they plant some houses, that the animals should somehow know and respect boundaries. That's kind of tough when the animals are on a huge plot of land where they've never been hunted and never even been threatened by anything other than a bigger animal. Folks seem to think this is a great vacation spot for them. What they don't realize is it's also a great vacation spot for the animals. I hopped in the company truck and started toward my first destination of the night. An elderly couple had been terrorized by a deer that literally broke in through a sliding glass door. They managed to trap it in a side room and needed someone to go release it. I got elected. When I got there, the vacationers looked like the ones caught in headlights. They were still wide-eyed. I could tell they were in shock. I had them go into another room and close the door. Once they were out of the way, I found the closest door to the outside and opened it. Then I went to the room with the deer in it. I slowly opened the door and was shocked to find the room covered in blood. The deer was laying on the floor, panting. I approached it slowly, circling around to leave the doorway open, hoping to give it an escape route. The closer I got, the more I realized this deer wasn't going anywhere. Its side was covered with claw marks. At first I thought a coyote had attacked it, but the marks were too far apart. They were large enough to be caused by a bear, but the individual claws were too far apart. I'd never seen anything like this. If I had to compare it to something, I'd say Freddy Krueger sliced it up. The deer's eyes went wide when I approached it, but it didn't jump up and run. I took this as a bad sign. Its breath came in ragged gasps as I struggled to roll it over. Once I did, it was my turn to struggle breathing. Its entire side was torn to shreds, but that wasn't the worst part. There were large chunks that were missing. I examined the wounds and found bite marks where the missing flesh should have been. But the bites were massive. If it wouldn't have challenged the laws of nature as well as my own sanity, I would have said it was bitten by a shark. Blood poured out of the side, and the deer struggled to draw breath. I stood and left the room, leaving the poor creature the dignity of a private death. When I went back in, it was still. I took pictures with my cell phone and tried my best to carry the creature out without making more of a mess. After I got it loaded on the back of my truck, I went back inside and talked to the vacationers. When I opened the door to the room they were in, the woman's eyes grew wide and she started screaming. The man's eyes were the size of saucers as well. I approached them slowly with my arms outstretched to try to calm them down. It seemed to have the opposite effect. They started climbing the furniture and clawing at the walls. To get away from me, I decided to back away and give them some room. "What's wrong?" I said. The man pointed a shaky finger at me. You're covered in blood," he said. "The deer got you," the woman said. "You've got rabies." "Or worse," the man said, keeping his distance. "I'm sorry, folks," I said. "This is the deer's blood." "You killed it just for breaking in," the woman said. "What?" "No, it was already injured. I just took it to my truck." The couple seemed to settle down and consider this. "So you don't have rabies?" the man said slowly, looking me up and down. "Or anything else?" the woman said, hiding behind her husband. "No, ma'am, I'm fine." She took her turn, eyeing me up and down, I assumed looking for wounds. Being satisfied, they asked the one question I didn't want to answer. "So what killed the deer?" the man said. I really don't know, I said truthfully. Having just gotten them calmed down, I didn't want to send them back into a panic. It was probably just a coyote, I said. A coyote, the man said, diving back into the pool of panic. Or a bear, I said, trying and failing to calm them. A bear, the woman said, diving in after her husband. You know, folks, you've had a traumatic night, I said. I can't tell you what to do, but if I were you, We're leaving, the woman said, dragging her husband out of the room. That sounds like a good idea, I said. And then, like an idiot, I added, I hope you enjoyed your stay. They either didn't hear me or ignored me. Either way, it wasn't long until I heard a car start, then roar away from the house. I went back into the room where the deer had been trapped and started working backwards from there, trying to find out what had happened. It wasn't hard to pick up the trail. It had been bleeding badly. Seeing the bites and claw marks made that fairly obvious. I tracked back through the kitchen and out the smashed glass door. Once outside, I turned on my flashlight. The trail was a little harder to follow, but not much. I could still see drops of blood beside its tracks as I followed them back toward the pond behind the house. I approached the pond and saw signs of a struggle. This must have been where the deer was attacked. There were other tracks in with the deers, but they didn't make sense to me. They were large, too large. Their shape was odd as well. If I had to call them anything, I would have called them duck prints, but massive, larger than any duck by many times. A giant duck with shark teeth. I think I'll leave that out of my report, I thought. It suddenly struck me what the tracks were. It was a man with swim fins on his feet. But why? Why go to all that trouble to poach a deer when you can just knock it out with a tranquilizer gun? My mind sent me an answer, but I didn't like it. What if the man is a psychopath, just getting his kicks by killing an animal with his bare hands? I thought about the mental hospital in the neighboring county and wondered if one of their patients had taken an unsanctioned leave of absence and they were trying to keep it quiet. I didn't like that thought one bit, aside from the fact that it didn't explain the huge bites on the deer. It also meant we had someone who might suddenly get a taste for killing. Doing this to animals was horrible, but what if he decided to go after something bigger? I shot a look at the house, wondering how many vacationers were within a short walk from this spot, and how many were armed. As I contemplated the safety of the people in the area, I heard something behind me. I whipped around and shone my light, but saw nothing. I scanned the pond and saw a ripple emanating from the middle. Probably just a fish jumping. I took some more pictures of the struggle area with my phone, then started back toward my truck. I had more calls to answer and this riddle would have to wait. I drove halfway around the lake, around 3 miles, to the other vacation home, where a break-in had been reported. When the woman in her 30s answered the door, she took a step back. "Oh my," she said, looking at the dried blood all over my uniform. "Good evening, ma'am. Sorry about my appearance," I said. "Did you report a break-in?" "Yes, we did. Please come in," she said in a friendly tone, yet gave me a wide berth while closing the door. She led me upstairs to the kitchen. For some reason, I was expecting to find blood all over like with the last house. However, this was a completely different mess. She showed me the door. It had been forced open, but not shattered like the last one. There was only a small amount of glass broken. Then the door latch had been unlocked, and the door slid open. There were faint images of my giant duck tracks like the last house. My spine turned to ice. This house was over 3 miles away from the other. There were many more people in that space that might have fallen victim to this crazed person. The woman showed me the rest of the kitchen and the mess that had been left. There were a few cans of sardines that had been opened and eaten, and also some cans of tuna fish. The strange thing was how they were opened. The cans had been torn into with something sharp, but not a can opener. The marks looked like they were torn open with claws. I shuddered to imagine the amount of strength it took to do something like that. And then I spotted it. Beside one of the cans of tuna was a small puddle of blood. "Ma'am, could I trouble you for a sandwich bag?" I said. She handed me one, and I carefully tried to scrape as much blood into it as possible. I sealed it and put it in my pocket, then went out through the broken door. Behind the house, just like with most of these vacation houses, there was a pond. I traced the tracks back to it, and they disappeared at the waterline. I shone my light over the water, but the only thing I saw was a stray turtle. I stared at it for a long time, as though it would somehow give me a clue as to what was going on. "What should we do?" the woman said, nearly scaring me half to death. I hadn't heard her follow me out the door and into the yard. "I'll send someone around to look at that door in the morning," I said. "In the meantime, it might not be a bad idea to sleep in a room that has a lock on the door. I'm sure they won't be back, but just in case." She didn't seem very comforted by that idea, but thanked me as I left. The next 2 reports were just teenagers breaking in and stealing beer. That was it. No bloody wildlife, no weird tracks. Just kids being kids. I went back to the station, changed out of my bloody uniform, and spent the rest of the night filling out reports on what had happened. When my shift was over and I passed on what had happened, I took a little trip to the neighboring county. I stopped in at the mental hospital and asked if they had any escapes lately. The nurse looked at me like I had asked her if she was wearing deodorant. "We don't have escapes," she said, with obvious pride that showed as arrogance. I thanked her and left, feeling less than satisfied with her answer. Next, I stopped in at the local police department and asked one of my friends on the force if they could analyze the blood sample for me. I shared my thoughts that there might be an escapee from the mental hospital, and the blood sample might help us find out who and track him down. It was well past noon until I got to bed. That night when I got to work, it was pandemonium. There had been more break-ins and people were starting to panic. The owner of the resort was frantic. People were cancelling left and right and wanting their money back. When I walked in, he stormed the pudgy face right up into mine. "You told people to go home," he fumed, glaring up at me. I merely suggested, "Do you want to pay their rental out of your salary?" "I work for the state, not you," I said. He turned a deeper shade of red. "Would you rather see people in body bags instead of animals?" I said. "That wouldn't do much for business now, would it?" He turned fire engine red and stormed out, mumbling, "We'll see." I investigated 5 break-ins that night. Only 2 of them were legit. The rest seemed like half-hearted attempts to stage a break-in so they could get out of paying for their rental. The 2 real ones shared the same characteristics as before, just enough of a broken window to open the door. The cans of whatever seafood was available. They even got shrimp out of the freezer. Everything about the way the intruder acted pointed to a person. All I needed to know was who. Again, I followed the tracks back to the nearby pond. I stood for a long time, studying the surface of the water. I knew these ponds were all designed the same. A roughly 40-yard by 40-yard body of water around 5 feet deep in the middle, stocked with mostly bluegill for catch and release fishing. Anyone using these ponds to hide would have to be holding their breath for inhuman periods of time. I stared at the surface for 20 minutes. If someone was out there, they had an invisible snorkel or an extra set of lungs. After my rounds of investigating and reporting, I decided to stick around and do a little extra investigating. I ran home, grabbed my swim trunks, mask and snorkel, and went to the site of the most recent break-in. I waded out into the water, unsure of what I would find when a snake slithered past me. I let it go and waded deep enough to where I could swim. I hovered at the level of the surface, dipping my mask underwater to get a glimpse of whatever there was to see. There wasn't much. Fish, underwater plants, and lots of water. Just what you would expect from a pond. As I kept going towards the middle, the water was getting deeper. I now couldn't touch the bottom. I had to float on the surface. Looming in front of me was a dark spot on the bottom of the pond. I took it for a rock, but swam close enough to investigate anyway. In for a penny, in for a pound. As I drew close enough to hover over it, I realized it wasn't a rock. I took a deep breath and dove to find out what it was. The further I swam down, the further I was able to swim down. I kept going and going. Light disappeared. I was sure I had been swimming straight down for a solid minute, without touching the bottom. I turned and looked up. The surface of the pond was only a pinprick of light. My lungs screamed at me to turn around. I had no choice but to comply. I clawed at the water in desperation. It seemed like I was swimming in mud, or something was pulling me down, almost like a force or current pushing against me, wanting me to drown before I could fully explore this hidden secret. After what felt like an eternity, I broke the surface of the water and gasped for air. I swam over to the shallows and walked out of the pond. I collapsed on the shore and lay there for a long time, trying to regain my breath. As my brain received oxygen, I thought about what had happened, and if it had been real, an illusion, or if I had just gotten turned around somehow and stuck at the bottom. I had to find out. I wasted no time driving 2 counties over and renting some dive equipment along with a light. So armed, I returned to the pond and walked toward the middle again. This time, when I dove toward the dark spot, I was able to see exactly what it was. I used the flashlight to examine the darkness. As I swam deeper, the sides closed in on me as if I was swimming down the gullet of some massive fish. I've never been claustrophobic before, but that was rapidly changing. I barely had any room to maneuver as the sides closed in. I contemplated turning around, but there was no room. I could feel myself start to panic. I had to focus to keep my breaths regular. I was very close to a panic attack when suddenly the tunnel opened up again. The sides grew further apart. I checked my watch, and I had been under for 15 minutes. The sides of the tunnel had spread out so far they were barely visible, and I could see a light ahead of me. I swam toward it, desperate to get out of this water. I broke through the surface and looked around. I was in the pond. Somehow I had gotten turned around and was back in the pond. I swam to the side until I could stand and walked out to the shore. Looking around, I made a startling discovery. I was in a pond, the same one as the break-in last night. Somehow there was a hidden tunnel between the 2 ponds. That's how the robber never gets caught. He just swims to the next pond slick as snot. No fuss, no muss. I now knew the how, but I needed to know more. As tempting as it was to swim back through the tunnel, I was still a little shaken and didn't want to risk an underwater panic attack. I walked back to my truck, took off my dive equipment, and drove back to the dive shop. I asked about frequent customers, especially for refilling tanks. They told me they had a few regulars that came in every weekend, but no one knew and no one who needed refilled more than once a week. I asked if there were any other dive shops in the area, and they told me the next closest one was over 100 miles away. I went home frustrated. It wasn't making sense. He would need air to swim back and forth through that tunnel, and that was his escape route. I was sure of it. I tried to sleep through the afternoon, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. It was working on the impossible puzzle of how the robber was getting air. I borrowed a couple trail cams and set one up at each pond. I needed to see if he had some new tank system or what. I also wanted to identify him and shut him down fast. I made sure to stay away from those ponds that night, so he would feel free to do his thing. In the morning, I gathered the cameras and took them home. I downloaded both memory cards before watching the video. Just as the second download was finished, my phone rang. "Hello?" I said. "Hey John, it's Steve. I got the results from that blood you gave me the other day." "Great," I said, hitting the play button on my computer. "Were you able to get a match on any hospital records?" "Not exactly." "Why not?" I asked, as a ghostly green image appeared on my computer. The image was blurred, but it was definitely the size of a man walking upright toward the camera. I clicked to the next slide and froze at what I saw. "Well, the thing is, the blood you gave me came back as reptile DNA." I registered the words he said in my mind, just like I registered the image on my computer screen, but I just couldn't place them in reality. "Are you there?" he said into the phone. "Yes, I'm sorry," I said. "Could you send a copy of your findings to my office?" "Sure, no problem." "Thanks, I appreciate it. You really helped me figure this out." "Any time," he said cheerfully before hanging up. I hadn't taken my eyes off the computer screen the whole time. No matter how long I stared at it, I couldn't make my mind acknowledge it as real. Standing there, large as life, was not a man in a wetsuit. It was a creature. I could see the wide mouth full of sharp teeth that looked exactly like the bites on the deer. I could see the webbed feet that looked like swim fins. Only they had claws sticking out of the front where toes would be. I saw the razor-sharp claws on its webbed hands. It was a full-on nightmare staring me in the face. I sat back and thought for a long time. Then I printed copies of the images and put them in an envelope. I rushed to the station to share the information I had with my fellow rangers. As I was showing them, their faces ranged in emotions from shock to disbelief to outright mocking. As I was going through my investigation, the owner of the timeshares walked in. "What are we all looking at?" he said, eyeing me with contempt. "It seems like John has solved the case of the break-ins," one of the other rangers said. The owner approached. He picked up the lab report and read it, then stared for a long time at the picture. "Do you know what this is?" he said absently. "I really don't know yet," I said. "I've never seen anything like it." He turned to me and smiled. "This is money," he said, holding up the picture. "What do you mean?" I said. "Those idiots that go around hunting, what do they call them? Cryptids?" "Yeah, cryptids. They'll pay through the nose if they think they can find something like this. And then there's the TV shows and merchandising," he said. "You may have saved my financial hide," he beamed at me. "I don't think you understand," I said. "This is a dangerous animal. If you had seen what it did to that deer." "So what do you want to do, hunt it down and kill it?" "Maybe not kill it, but definitely tranquilize it and take it to a secure location where it can't hurt anyone." "You dumb son of a bitch," he yelled. "I could make a mint. I wouldn't even have to repair those houses. They would all rush in to investigate and leave piles of cash in my bank account." "But what about the people?" "Who cares about the people?" he said. "Throw them all out. I've got the chance of a lifetime beating down my front door, and you want to flush it down the toilet because you're scared someone might break a nail." He was breathing hard and staring up into my face. The air was charged with fury, his and mine. And then a sudden calm came over him. "Charles," he said, addressing the lead ranger, "isn't this a wildlife preserve?" "Yes, it is," Charles said warily. "And aren't the wildlife on this preserve protected from all tampering by law?" "Well, I guess so," Charles said. "What if those animals present a threat?" I said to Charles. "How many deer were killed by coyotes on this preserve last year?" the owner said. "Dozens," Charles said. "Were the coyotes removed from the preserve?" "No," Charles said. The owner turned and shot me a triumphant look. "John," Charles said, "I know you have everyone's best interests in mind, but you're going to have to let this go." I glared at him. And what happens when this thing decides it likes to eat humans? All the eyes in the room that had been on me suddenly found somewhere else to look, all but the owner. He was smiling from ear to ear. I think the pudgy little bastard was about to break into the happy dance. I searched the room for any support, but found none. I pulled my badge off my shirt, quietly laid it on the desk, and left. If that was the end of my story, I would say I had failed. I took my pension and rented one of the houses on the preserve. The owner had leaked through social media that a cryptid had been spotted on the preserve. As he had guessed, the cryptid hunters and TV crews came in droves, renting everything in sight. My goal was different. I already knew it existed. I knew how it got around without being detected. I stayed at one of the break-in houses. Every night I took a huge tuna I had bought, fresh that morning, and laid it out beside the pond. I sat in the dark living room and watched the first night as it approached the fish with more caution than curiosity. After sniffing it for a long time, it grabbed it and dove for the pond. Each night after, I laid out a fish, and the creature became less cautious. It was being fed, and the media frenzy was starving. The hunters had found nothing. There were no sightings as long as I fed it. Everyone had their cameras set up. The few that roamed around left me alone when they saw someone in the house. I guess they thought I was another cryptid hunter and respected my privacy. As the number of sightings stayed at zero, they started turning on the owner, calling him a fraud. His reputation plummeted. After a week with no sightings, people started leaving. In desperation, he did the wrong thing. He hired an actor to dress in a creature suit and roam around. Of course, the hunters and shows saw right through this and destroyed what was left of his reputation. I had rented the house for 2 weeks. Between the rent and the fish, my money was running out. I had kept the people safe, but what would happen when I stopped feeding it? I had managed to clear out most of the people so they would be safe. But what about my fellow rangers? What would happen when it became desperate? When the starving creature no longer had houses full of food to break into? I had 3 more nights until I had to leave. I was out of money. The preserve had become a ghost town. As far as I knew, I was the only renter left. It was decision time. I sat staring at the large tuna on the table with a bottle of bleach next to it. Let it live and see what happens, or kill it. I thought about this for a long time. Both options had merits and consequences. I chose a third option, a much more dangerous one. I took the fish out and laid it where I usually did, then backed up a few feet and stood there. Over an hour passed before the water stirred. I saw the head and eyes of the creature appear as it headed toward the fish, and then it stopped. It had seen me. I made sure to keep still with my arms at my side. It slowly approached and stood. It was a few feet away with the fish in between us. It studied me and sniffed the air, then became agitated. Perhaps it had smelled my scent before as a pursuer. It let out a soft hiss, but bent down and took the fish, keeping its eyes on me the entire time. Then once it had its meal, it did the most incredible physical display I've ever seen. It leapt 20 feet in the air and landed in a perfect dive right in the middle of the pond, leaving almost no splash. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and collapsed to the ground shaking. Once I had recovered, I went back inside and fell into a fitful sleep. That was only part of my plan. The next night would decide who lived and who died. I did exactly like the night before, minus the fish. The creature approached, stepped up to me and looked around for the fish. I showed it my empty hands. It sniffed at them and growled, having smelled the scent of fish. It looked at my hands, and I wondered if it was going to bite them off as a substitute. It hissed at me and sniffed my face. I saw it flexing its claws the whole time. I stared into its face, those massive razor-sharp teeth, and swallowed hard. I did all I could to stay still, to show it I wasn't a threat. My heart hammered in my chest. It opened its jaws and showed me those horrible teeth. Its breath was a horrid stench I had never smelled, and hoped to never again. I closed my eyes, not knowing if they would ever open. Seconds fell into minutes. I opened my eyes and I was alone. There wasn't even a ripple in the water. I sighed. My decision had been made. It had shown restraint, and I would too. I went back inside, packed, and left. I could only hope and pray that the people that remained, including my former co-workers, would be safe. I went home and slept restlessly. In the morning, there was a report in the newspaper on a break-in at the wildlife preserve. They said the only thing that was taken were cans of tuna fish. I smiled ruefully and wondered how long it would stay that way. If you're reading this, don't go looking for this thing. If you see it, don't tell others about it. Just leave it alone and hope for the best. I'm a park ranger, and in order to survive, I had to make my own rules. I've been a park ranger for a little under 6 months, and I almost quit in my first week. You see, I've always preferred being in nature as opposed to the city, mostly because I enjoy the quiet. And when I was a kid, watching Crocodile Hunter and other nature conservation shows and stories. I love animals. The things I've seen and had to deal with, though, I'm not sure they classify as even real. The first night I showed up to work, I arrived 10 minutes early, and little did I know at the time, it was the worst mistake I made on my first day. It's a small park, and it didn't need more than 2 rangers on site at a time, but most of the time we just had one. I was greeted by the ranger from the shift before on arrival and given the rundown of what I'd be doing that night, mostly just hanging out in the information building and monitoring trail and site cameras once every couple of hours in the 10-hour shift. I would patrol one of the 4 quadrants the park was divided into. What no one told me my first day is that the night shift park ranger either goes missing or dies within the first week. I found this out later that night, and not from the first shift ranger. After the first 2 hours of monitoring cameras and helping the 2 people that stopped by the information center, I set out on patrol, choosing the quadrant I went to at random. In the end, I decided on the east quadrant, one of the more undisturbed areas of the park. I hopped in the sorry excuse for a patrol car, more like a buggy or ATV than a car, and headed towards the east quadrant. It was a quiet drive for the most part, except for the sounds of crickets and occasional owls hoot. But as I got closer to the east quadrant, I noticed the sounds began to die away, slowly but surely, until all was silent. I preferred the quiet anyway, so the sounds dying away was less alarming than it was calming for me. I had a smile on my face as I began making my round. I expected not to find many, if any, campers in this section of the park, but about halfway through my patrol, I came across a bald man stumbling down the trail. I stopped the car a little ways away from him, weak headlights shining directly at him. I pulled out my flashlight and hopped out of the car, approaching the hobbling man. "Excuse me, sir. Are you all right? You don't look that well." He had stopped dead in his tracks when I noticed him, but I hardly took notice of it as I approached. The only thing that struck me as strange was the fact that the man had his head tilted down, so a shadow cast across his face. He spoke with a speech impediment. He spoke slowly and deeply, and it sounded like his mouth was stuffed with bread. He hadn't moved a muscle, and I never saw his mouth open as he spoke. It struck me as odd, and I stopped with a little bit of distance between us. The injured-looking man hadn't moved at all since I spotted him. "You must be the new ranger." I noticed a slight amount of movement in the shadows splayed across his face, and a small amount of noise, like something being sharpened or sliced. I found it odd that this man was able to identify me as the new ranger, but maybe he was just a regular to the park. I am. Do you need help? It's been so long since I've had a meal ranger. Help me. I had brought along a few protein bars with me, wanting a snack for the shift, and I had brought some along as I didn't know how long the patrol would take. Come with me, back over to my patrol car. Have you been lost out here, sir? Do you need any assistance other than food? The strange man made no move to come closer. He just stood where I had first found him, stone still. I am only hungry. Ranger. I stared at him for a few more moments, before turning to walk back to my patrol car. Then come with me. I'll give you some protein bars, and after that I think you should come with me. I trailed off because at that moment I felt and heard something behind me, breathing down my neck and breathing heavily. From behind I heard, "Last mistake you'll ever make, Ranger. Now I can eat." I heard the snapping of bones from behind me as the strange man slammed into my back, winding me and knocking me to the ground. I tried to catch my breath and scramble up and towards my patrol car, but with surprising speed after such a forceful blow. The man put all of his weight onto my back. I heard a guttural sound coming from the man behind me and felt a slimy smattering of something wet drip onto and soak through my uniform. I had begun to recover from the blow to my back and noticed I still clutched the flashlight in my hand. I took in a sharp, quick breath, bracing myself as I twisted and swung wildly, connecting with the butt of the flashlight to something as his foot slid off my back. I took a look up at the man and noticed the most horrifying image I'd ever seen up to that point. His mouth hung open in the most inhuman way, and rows of long needle and saw-like teeth, the number of which was impossibly large. Drool dripped from his mouth, and the sickly sweet smell of rotting flesh and death assaulted my nostrils. The man was posed like a tiger ready to pounce as I stared at him, but the longer I stared in horror at this monstrosity, the more I noticed he wouldn't move a muscle. The creature in front of me snarled as I began backing up slowly, scooting my way across the ground towards the patrol car. You got lucky this time. Ran, Dodger, I'll get you. Next time, you come to this place. Just like the last. He made a noise, an unearthly noise like stones grinding together mixed with the call of a wild animal. Something about his face gave me the impression he was amused, like he was laughing. I got to my feet and kept eye contact as I opened the door to my patrol car and climbed inside, trembling and struggling to get the key into the ignition as I stared at the creature. I noticed he still didn't move if I blinked, so luckily I didn't have to strain my eyes, but multitasking and spatial awareness were already not my strong suit. I struggled for another 5 minutes before starting the patrol vehicle back up, and I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, swerving around the man and trying to make my way around the circuit to get back to the information center. The haunting laughter of the creature followed me as it echoed throughout the forest. I feel like he let me go on purpose. It's like he got bored of easy kills, and now he wants to hunt me. I hastily completed the circuit and made it back to the information center. This thing had told me he had killed other rangers in the past, but there's no mention at all of anything like him in the park. So as soon as I made it back to the information center, I began to write out a list, a reminder for myself and the next ranger. After I quit this place, because at the time, I convinced myself I was going to be able to quit. I took a sheet of printer paper from the machine and began writing. Rules to survive the night shift. Rule 1. Never break line of sight with the bald man with the strange lisp. If you do, pray he lets you go. I'm a park ranger at Mount Rainier. People keep going missing. and I think I found out why. 25, that is the number of people who have gone missing at the park since the beginning of the year, with nothing being done or said about it. In fact, I'm pretty sure I'll lose my job when they find this posting, but I have other things to be scared of at this point, and this needs to get out. I'm a wilderness ranger at Mount Rainier. My job is to walk the hundreds of miles of trail and wilderness in the park, looking for problems and helping lost and injured hikers. In the old days, any lost hiker would mean all of us going out together, putting together a search plan and doing our best to get them home safely. Things are different today ever since the start of 2022. Whenever a person gets reported as missing, the family is assured we are on it and will do our best to find them, and promise that they will dispatch us to look. As soon as the family is gone, our bosses tell us that they'll have a search and rescue company take over, and if we know what's best for our jobs, we should just focus on checking trail conditions and doing the rest of our jobs. And so it's gone on since 2022. At first, there were just a few people missing here and there all over the park. It didn't seem that unusual, other than our rangers not being involved in the search, but we figured it was some new policy and shrugged it off. More people started disappearing as the year went on, making all of us wonder what was going on, and why it had been made clear to us we should keep our mouths shut. Personally, I figured it was just a combination of bad trail conditions from a rough winter, an influx of inexperienced hikers, and the Park Service trying to avoid looking bad when we needed more funding. Until last Thursday. It was an overcast day, and I was walking along the trail up to Ipsut Pass in the Carbon River area, humming quietly to myself to pass the time, and wondering how far up I would go before I had to put on crampons, when I saw it, off to the side of the trail, maybe 50 feet into the forest. There was an odd light on the forest floor. At first I thought the light was just a reflection off of water or some trash someone had left, but as I moved closer, the light didn't fade or change, it just stayed steady. Maybe it was a lost flashlight. I had walked this trail dozens of times and never noticed it before. I knelt down, taking my pack off, and saw that the light seemed to be coming from just under the dirt. For some reason I felt uneasy. I looked around to see if anyone else was nearby on the trail, and saw no one. Shrugging, I reached into the dirt to poke at the light and see what it was. Poking around, I found the corner of a slightly open trapdoor that was at most only a foot wide on each side. It was camouflaged nearly perfectly. If it had not been left just barely ajar with the light exposed, there is no way anyone would have seen it from the trail. The space was small, with enough room for one person if they didn't mind contorting themselves. On the walls of the burrow were dozens of Polaroid photos of people hiking. All of the photos seemed to have been taken very low to the ground. The photos were from all over the park, many dozens or more miles apart. Most of the photos I didn't recognize, but among them I saw a few that I knew for a fact were hikers that had gone missing over the last year. Then my heart stopped. I saw a photo of me hiking along the Ipsut Pass trail. Around a half hour ago, asterisk, crack, asterisk. I heard a twig snap somewhere around me. I took my head out of the burrow and started running down the trail the way I came. I didn't look back or stop until I got to the wilderness cabin near Ipsut campground. I locked and barricaded the door and waited until another ranger showed up the next morning, not sleeping a wink. I asked him to walk back along the Ipsut Pass trail with me. He was annoyed that I wouldn't say why, but agreed. We spent an hour looking, but couldn't find any sign of the burrow. I asked for some time off right afterwards, and my manager seemed very suspicious and demanded to know why. I made up some excuse about my family and didn't tell him or anyone else what I saw. For some reason, I knew that telling them would at best end with me losing my job. I don't know who or what made that burrow, but I think it's taking people at Rainier, and for some reason, the government is covering it up. I wish that was the end of the story, but it's not. This afternoon I saw something glinting from within the air vent on the floor of my kitchen. I thought maybe my cat had stuck another toy in it. I took the grating off the vent to take the toy out. Instead of a cat toy, I found a Polaroid photo taken low to the ground of me making breakfast this morning. Things in the woods. I'll never forget that night. I'm a park ranger, and that is all you will learn about me, aside from this story. During the summer of 2008, I had been assigned to a watchtower in the middle of a heavily forested area. Most nights it was uneventful, and I tended to just read a book as I waited for my shift to end. However, this night, when I started my shift, the guy I took over from was shaken up. Concerned, I asked him what was wrong. He just shook his head and said, "There are things in the woods." He didn't say anything else and just left me standing there like a jackass. Jerk. Well, I set up for the night and took out my book. It was a Bentley Little, The Mailman, and I found myself surprised by how much I enjoyed it. Sometime around an hour into my shift, something struck the window. I jumped and quickly set the book down before checking it out. I had expected it was either a big bug or some poor bird. It was a bird all right, but not what I had been expecting at all. This bird was clearly dead long before it had collided with the window, both wings torn right off and stripped of all feathers. It was bound together with straps made from long grass blades. With the clear evidence that this was man-made, I quickly took out my flashlight and began scanning the area beneath me. I couldn't see much through the woods, however, as I did a quick double-take. I swear I saw a shape dart away out of the light. I feel this needs some elaborating. I could barely make out anything, but when I brought my light over this thing, I only got a brief glimpse. I literally couldn't describe it for the life of me. This thing was fast. Too fast. "All right, punks. If you're out there, show yourself right now." I used my most commanding voice possible. Nothing. As I drew my pistol, I heard the radio crackle. Naturally, I went to check and picked up the receiver. As I held it up to my ear, I could only hear static, so I at first assumed that it was a glitch. But right as I decided to set it down, something stopped me. Call it intuition. Something just wasn't right. And then I realized what it was. I could hear something over the radio. It was faint, so I really had to strain to hear it. Slowly, I could make out what sounded like faint, low humming. There was a pattern to it, a steady beat that started low, built up carefully, then dropped back down in an instant. I don't know how long I listened to that humming, but eventually I turned off the radio, ready to radio it in. Then I realized I could still hear the humming. Without a second thought, I drew my pistol and turned around on my heel before steadily walking back outside. The humming sounded like it was all around me, following that same pattern. I still had to strain to make it out, but there was no question it was there. I swiveled around, pistol aimed at empty air. Every part of me was screaming to call for backup, but I wasn't sure what I needed backup for. I needed some definitive proof of what I was dealing with. So I waited, on guard and ready, and then it stopped. As I became accustomed to the silence, I realized how all-encompassing it was. I couldn't hear anything, not even a bug chirping. Cautiously turning my flashlight back on, I pointed it down at the base of the tower. Nothing. Nothing whatsoever. Then I heard a creak. I immediately spun around, processing this information. At first, I dismissed it as just the wood contracting, but then there was another creak, and another. Something was up here with me. It took me a few moments to realize that it was just around the corner. In that moment, fight or flight kicked in full gear. I chose fight. I rounded the corner and found nothing. Absolutely nothing. I'm not ashamed to admit I was unnerved, but I still had a job to do. With no other option, I decided to call for backup. I should have done that a long time ago. I realized that when I saw the receiver had been cut right off. I stared, dumbfounded for a few moments, before grabbing my walkie-talkie instead. But when I turned it on, all I got was a harsh whine right in my ear, which caused me to drop it as I recovered. Once I had, I immediately tried to find it, but it was gone. My situation was desperate. I was now completely cut off with some thing or other that seemed to defy all sense. If I was going to make it out of this, I had to stay put and wait for someone to come check on me. I still had my pistol drawn, waiting and waiting. Absent-mindedly, I quickly shone my flashlight outside one last time, and this time I finally saw them, standing among the trees, staring up at me. They had been avoiding me all this time, so to see so many of them, you're probably wondering what they were. I'd rather not tell you, for my sake. I was at my limit then, and screamed, turning off my flashlight and pointing my gun right at the door. There I stayed for the rest of my shift, unwilling to move from that spot. I consider it a miracle I lasted for the rest of my shift. By the time someone finally arrived to see why I wasn't checking in, I poured out everything I had gone through. At first, the other ranger looked at me like I was crazy, but when he asked if I had any proof, something landed on the roof of his car. It was another dead, naked and wingless bird wrapped in grass. Needless to say, we booked it right out of there. When I got back and made a report about what had happened, I demanded to speak with the last guy who had been on shift. I really wanted to let him have it for not warning me of what was out there. But here's the thing, we never found him. We searched high and low, checked every single record for a trace, tried to look up his name when we could remember it. But for all intent and purposes, it seemed like he had never existed in the first place. So what the hell took his shift? I'm a ranger with the Forestry Service. I have disturbing story to tell. For many years I, Matt, reveled in the silence of this forest. Throughout my life I had grown accustomed to its whispers, knowing every tree, every pathway, as well as my own fingers. I was a guardian of the forest, a person who connected with nature on a level that others could only dream of. My morning routine began with awakening to the melody of bird songs. I loved that sound. It reminded me that each new day welcomed me into the embrace of this green kingdom. After dressing, as I stepped out of my modest cabin, I was greeted by the cool morning air, saturated with the scent of freshness. My work was a part of me, and I was a part of it. I monitored the condition of the forest, checked the health of the trees, and cared for biodiversity. Being a forester was not just a job for me, it was a calling. My communication with these wise trees, green leaves, and lively streams made me happy. People might have thought that such a life was monotonous, but for me, it had its own rhythm, its own harmony. This forest became my home, and I was its guardian. My days passed in tranquility, and it seemed that nothing could disturb this idyllic existence. However, fate had something in store for me that would change all my foundations. And so, it began. At first, I didn't pay much attention to these strange tracks, hoping they were simply the result of some wild creature passing by randomly. However, the longer I observed them, the more they turned into a puzzle I couldn't ignore. These tracks were unlike anything I had ever seen. They were too large for foxes or raccoons, and too unusual to belong to a bear. None of the animals known to me in this forest could leave such prints. My knowledge of the local fauna was impeccable, but these imprints defied the usual order. I started waking up at night thinking about these tracks, They haunted me in my dreams, leaving a strange residue of unease. I traversed the forest back and forth, trying to find some logical explanation, but they simply didn't fit into the picture of this world. Perhaps it was some new species that I was not familiar with. I delved into my books, flipping through pages, but found nothing similar. My anxieties intensified with each passing day. It felt as if something unfathomable had penetrated this forest, casting a shadow of the unknown over it. The more I sought logic in these strange tracks, the more they became mystical. They seemed to pursue me, getting closer to my cabin. In the evenings, when the forest fell silent, I heard rustling in the bushes, and something heavy moved around, leaving behind these enigmatic traces. An unknown presence hung in the air, like a ghost you can't see but feel is there. I felt as though I were being watched, and this thought haunted me. At night I heard footsteps around the cabin, but upon going outside I found no one. My nerves were stretched to the limit. During the day I tried to focus on my work, taking care of the forest, but when night fell, strange sounds and tracks returned, like ghosts from the past. I began to lose sleep, and every rustle put me on edge. Fear seized me, and I realized that this was something much darker than I could imagine, something that defied explanation in scientific terms. I knew I couldn't remain in this state of anxiety. Answers needed to be found before the shadow of this unknown completely consumed me. The night became even more ominous as strange sounds echoed around the cabin. Unidentified whispers and rustlings penetrated the darkness of the forest, as if nature itself was murmuring incomprehensible secrets to me. These sounds stirred anxiety, and my ability to discern their nature only heightened my unease. One morning, upon waking up, I noticed that the phone line connecting me to the outside world had been severed. My gaze fixated on the severed wires leading to my cabin. This was more than just strange noises in the night. Someone or something seemed to have deliberately cut my last tether to reality. Through the dense foliage of the forest I peered, trying to discern any signs of who or what could have committed such an act. My rifle became my only ally in this struggle against the unknown. I loaded it, sensing that soon this weapon might become the last line of defense in this strange dance with the unfamiliar. Yet, even armed to the teeth, I realized that I didn't know what I was truly facing, and that my cabin, once considered a refuge, was becoming a trap in something beyond my comprehension. The grey glow of the sunset slowly penetrated through the tree trunks as I ventured into the forest once again, armed with my rifle and a heightened sense of invisible danger. The nocturnal sounds, tracks, and the severed line continued to disturb my peace, and my work became increasingly tense. I moved forward resolutely only when the sun ascended into the heavens. One day, pushing through the dense foliage, I felt eyes upon me. Something unseen lurked in the forest, weaving among the trees like mist, yet I couldn't discern its distinct outlines. My heart slowed its rhythm, and I scrutinized the surrounding darkness, trying to spot the shadow standing in the shade. I continued to work, but only in the daylight. Every sound, every movement of the trees could be signs of an approaching unknown. The rifle became my guide and support. Yet even with armed hands, I felt vulnerable in the face of this mysterious entity that seemed to observe every step I took. One day, looking up towards the impenetrable part of the forest, I noticed it. Something covered in thick black fur, towering over 2.5 meters, with humanoid features. The gaze of the entity and mine intersected for a moment, freezing the blood in my veins. I sprinted towards my cabin, daring not to look back, and spent the entire night inside, awaiting the next day, relying solely on the sunlight, the only ally in this struggle against something that lurked in the shadows. With the dawn, as the first rays of the sun pierced through the branches, I resolutely decided to uncover what lurked in the depths of this forest. My experience as a forester and hands armed with a rifle carried confidence, but even the boldest confront the unknown. The tracks led me deeper into the forest, where even the most seasoned hunter rarely ventured. And there, amidst thick undergrowth, I saw it. It was something that defied description, a creature from the realm of nightmares. The face, flattened and covered in fur, resembled a nightmarish hybrid of a bear and a human. Its anatomy seemed grotesque and alien. A wide mouth with sharp teeth added horror to this strange being. The creature remained oblivious to my presence and continued moving deeper into the forest. My legs pulsed with determination, and I decided to follow it. At some point, I startled a nearby flock of birds, and the creature noticed me. It turned out to be even more intimidating and massive than I had thought. Now, standing before it, I realized its unnaturalness and understood that I was facing something beyond the scope of my experience. Gigantic, vivid orange eyes stared at me intensely, and I felt a chilling gaze piercing my soul. The creature was like a living nightmare, a creation that seemed out of place in this world. My resolve wavered, and terror took hold as I realized that my rifle, once capable of handling bears, now seemed powerless against this entity. A gunshot shattered the silence of the forest, and in that moment I felt the fate of this strange creature become inextricably linked with mine. Its cry pierced the air, filling it with an ominous echo. However, despite visible signs of pain, it did not immediately fall. Instead, the creature darted into the forest, its shadow disappearing among the trees. A mix of adrenaline and fear compelled me to run back to the cabin. Sounds echoed behind me, intensifying with each step I took. Suddenly, I realized that the creature I had shot had decided to seek revenge. Its swift footsteps drew nearer, and I could feel my body drenched in cold sweat. For long minutes I raced through the thickets, my heart pounding furiously and my lungs burning. The sounds of pursuit became more persistent, as if the creature had transformed into an unseen force, ready to engulf me. As I approached the cabin, I felt my strength draining from my legs. My gaze anxiously scanned the surroundings, trying to catch any signs that I was undoubtedly being pursued. The creature was determined not to let me go, and I knew that my life once again depended on the sole decision I could make in that moment. My legs, as heavy as stones, finally reached the cabin. With the last reserves of adrenaline, I forcefully slammed the door, creating a reliable barrier between me and the monster that was pursuing me. Yet, even through the thick wooden door, the sounds of its ominous roar penetrated. The silence in the forest was shattered by this howl emanating from the depths of the woods, filling the air with fear and apprehension. I had to make a difficult decision. Either stay in the cabin and confront something I couldn't even see, or gather the last of my strength and escape. Hearing the creature beginning to break down the door, I realized I had no choice. I fired all the rounds from the chamber towards the doors, and the bullets pierced the wood with a dull, unsettling creak. The creature screamed in pain, and I heard its footsteps receding. It was only a temporary respite, and I understood that the monster would return, ready for cruel vengeance. Deprived of choices, I reloaded the rifle and sprinted in the opposite direction into the forest, seeking salvation. 15 kilometers from my cabin lay a village, my only chance for rescue. Fear consumed me, and I ran through thick thickets, feeling my life hanging by a thread. My legs, almost refusing to obey, carried me through the darkness of the forest. The sounds of the creature's enraged cries behind me emphasized that it was not intending to retreat. With each step, the darkness thickened, and I could hear the evening chorus of nature being replaced by the ominous howl of my pursuer. Exhausted and frightened, I reached the village, where the surprised and fearful residents let me into one of the houses. There, as I caught my breath, I heard an old grandmother of the village begin to unveil ancient legends about the master of the forest, a being capable of regeneration and impervious to mortal weapons. She recounted how many hunters had disappeared in this forest, attempting to hunt the master. However, having ventured into these dark lands, I had encountered it face to face and managed to survive. It was astonishing for me to learn that the creature indeed was the master of the forest, and it wouldn't let me leave so easily. That night I realized that I had witnessed something beyond the bounds of reality, and I had managed to escape certain death. Yet this story remained in the depths of the forest, in that dark realm where the echoes of the ancient creature's howls resound, its secrets shrouded in mystery like the darkness of this enigmatic corner of the world.